When I turned 16, nobody offered me a home. They offered me leftovers. It was March of 1923, and the rains hadn't come yet. The settlement, if you could call it that, sat along a narrow shelf where the jungle thinned into exposed rock and wind-swept ridge. 18 families, a trading post, a mission chapel with a tin roof that sang in storms, and me, the boy whose father had drowned pulling timber across the river 2 years before, whose mother had followed him into the ground 6 months later, taken by a fever no one had a name for. For 2 years, I'd slept in corners, swept floors, carried water. I kept my mouth shut and my hands useful, because that was the only currency I had. But when I turned 16, the unspoken arrangement expired. I was no longer a child to be pitied. I was a mouth to be fed, and mouths cost money no one had. "There's an old storage tunnel near the ridge," one of the men told me. Garrett, who ran the supply depot and smelled permanently of kerosene. "Collapsed years ago. If you want to freeze in there, it's yours." He said it the way you'd offer a dog a bone you'd already chewed clean. The others standing nearby didn't even laugh hard. A few shook their heads. One woman looked away. They just didn't care. Not enough to stop it, and not enough to offer anything better. So I walked. The tunnel was carved halfway into the hillside, where the jungle canopy broke apart and gave way to loose soil and exposed stone. From the outside, it looked like exactly what they said it was. A mistake. Loose earth spilled from the entrance like a wound that hadn't healed. Roots hung exposed from the slope above, grasping at nothing. Cracks ran through the visible soil in jagged lines, and the whole face of the hill seemed to lean slightly forward, as if waiting for permission to fall. I stood there for a long time. This was supposed to be my inheritance. A buried mistake. A place where someone had dug too deep and quit too soon. And now it was mine, because no one else wanted the risk of standing near it. But I didn't leave. Something held me. Not hope, exactly, but the habit of looking closer. My father had taught me that before the river took him. "Don't trust the surface," he used to say. "The surface is just what the rain touches." So I stepped inside. The outer layer was fragile, yes. Powdery topsoil mixed with rotted leaf matter, maybe 2 feet deep, crumbling at every touch. But beneath that, the tunnel walls were cut into something different. Compacted clay, dense, gray-brown, and cold to the touch. The kind of clay that holds its shape under pressure and doesn't crack when it dries. Someone had known this was here. Someone had dug past the garbage soil on purpose. I moved deeper, running my hands along the walls. The back of the tunnel ended abruptly, but not in collapse. The rear wall was reinforced naturally by a horizontal band of limestone running through the hill like a buried spine. I could feel the change in texture, smooth and slightly damp where the stone met the clay. And the ceiling wasn't flat. It curved gently upward, a shallow arch that distributed weight outward instead of pressing straight down. This wasn't a failure. It was unfinished. Someone had started something intelligent here and walked away, or been forced away. The engineering was sound. The geology was cooperative. What was missing was time, labor, and someone stubborn enough to finish it. I sat down on the cold clay floor in the dark and made my decision. I stayed. The first week taught me that decisions mean nothing without follow-through. I began by clearing the collapsed debris from the entrance, mostly loose soil and broken root bundles that had fallen inward over years of neglect. I used a flat stone as a crude shovel, and my hands for the rest. By the end of the first day, My fingers were raw, and my back ached from stooping. But I could see the full dimensions of the space, roughly 12 feet deep, 6 feet wide, and just over 5 feet at the highest point of the ceiling arch. Small, but mine. The entrance was the weak point. The loose topsoil above it had no structure. One heavy rain, and it would slide again. So I cut timber from the edge of the jungle, selecting hardwood saplings no thicker than my forearm, and split them into wedges. I drove these deep into the compacted clay on either side of the entrance, creating a reinforced frame that transferred the weight of the soil above into the stable clay below, rather than letting it press down on open air. It took 4 days. I had no nails. I used wooden pegs carved with my father's knife, the only thing of his I still owned, and packed wet clay around each joint, letting it dry into a rigid seal. Above the tunnel, I carved a shallow drainage trench into the slope, angling it so that rainwater would be diverted sideways and away from the entrance before it could soak the soil directly above me. I lined the trench with flat stones pressed into the clay, crude but functional. Inside, I built a raised sleeping platform from lashed branches, elevating myself 8 inches off the floor. Cold air sinks. I knew this from sleeping in corners. The floor is always the coldest place. I insulated the walls with layered bark, stripped from fallen trees and woven branch mats, creating a dead air pocket that trapped warmth. On the 7th night, I lit my first fire inside the tunnel. It nearly killed me, not from flame, from smoke. I'd built the fire at the entrance, assuming the draft would carry the smoke outward. But the cool air pooling inside the tunnel created a pressure difference that pulled the smoke inward instead. Within minutes, I was on my hands and knees, eyes burning, lungs seizing, crawling toward the entrance while the walls disappeared into gray nothing. I lay outside in the dirt for 20 minutes, coughing until my ribs ached. Then I sat up and thought about it. The problem wasn't the fire. The problem was the airflow. Cool air settled inside the tunnel because it was denser than warm air. Warm smoke rose, but it had nowhere to go. The tunnel was a dead end with one opening. I needed a second opening. A vent. The next morning, I climbed the slope above the tunnel and calculated where the rear wall sat below the surface. I dug a narrow shaft, no wider than my fist, angled upward from the back ceiling of the tunnel to exit on the slope above, disguised beneath a pile of brush. The angle was critical. Too steep and rain would pour down it. Too shallow and the draft wouldn't pull. I settled on roughly 45 degrees and lined it with bark to prevent soil from crumbling inward. That night, I lit the fire again. This time, the warm smoke rose to the ceiling, traveled along the gentle curve, and was drawn upward through the vent shaft by the temperature difference between the cool tunnel air and the warmer air outside. The chamber cleared, the fire burned clean. I could breathe. I sat on my raised platform in the flickering light and felt something I hadn't felt in 2 years. Not safety, not comfort, competence. The weeks that followed were a quiet war against every problem the jungle could invent. Insects found me first. Ants, the small red kind that bite like sparks and travel in columns thousands strong, discovered my food cache within 3 days. I woke one morning to find a line of them running up the wall, across the ceiling, and down into the bark pouch where I stored dried fruit. They'd eaten through the wrapping overnight. Every piece of food was crawling. I threw it all out and started again. This time, I suspended everything from the ceiling using vine cordage, long loops tied to wooden pegs driven into the clay overhead. But the ants simply walked down the vines. so I smeared each cord with a paste of wood ash and crushed citrus leaves, replacing it every few days when the paste dried and lost its potency. The ants avoided it, most of them. The stubborn ones I picked off by hand each morning, a ritual that became as automatic as breathing. Humidity was a slower enemy, and a more insidious one. My woven wall insulation trapped warmth effectively. On clear nights, the interior of the tunnel stayed 15 or 20 degrees warmer than the open ridge. But warmth and moisture are partners in the jungle, and what I'd built was essentially a greenhouse for mold. Within 2 weeks, the inner bark layers began to soften and darken. A sweet, rotting smell crept into everything. Pale, fungal threads appeared on the underside of my sleeping platform. I pulled everything down, every bark panel, every woven branch mat, and dragged it into the sun to dry. It took 3 days. Then I rebuilt the insulation with gaps, narrow vertical channels between the layers, no wider than 2 fingers, that allowed air to circulate through the wall cavity while still slowing heat loss. I also added a second layer of bark on the outer face, creating a system that breathed: outer bark to shed moisture, air gap to dry, inner bark to retain warmth. It was a compromise. The tunnel was slightly cooler at night, but the walls stayed dry and the mold didn't return. Each failure taught me something specific. Each solution created a new problem to solve. This was the rhythm of the place, not punishment, but instruction. Water was both problem and solution. The limestone band at the rear wall wept, a slow, steady seep of groundwater that had been filtering through stone and clay for decades, maybe centuries. I noticed it on my 4th day, a faint darkening of the rock surface that turned to a thin film of moisture by evening. It was clean, no discoloration, no smell, no sediment. Cleaner than the river, certainly, which carried the mud of the entire hillside. I carved a small basin into the clay floor, directly below the seep, and let it fill overnight. By morning, I had perhaps half a gallon, enough for a full day of drinking, cooking, and washing my hands without walking to the river. I lined the basin with flat stones to keep the clay from dissolving back into the water, and covered it with a bark lid to keep insects and debris out. I began to eat better as the weeks progressed. The jungle around the ridge was dense with fruit I recognized. Papaya trees grew in clusters where the canopy broke open, their heavy orange fruit hanging like lanterns. Plantain palms stood along the lower trails, and a small sour berry my mother had called monkey stone grew in dark red clusters near the canopy edge, tart enough to make your jaw ache, but rich with a sharpness that woke up your blood in the morning. I set simple snare lines along the animal trails I'd identified, loops of vine cordage placed where narrow paths funneled between root buttresses. I caught small game, agoutis mostly, fast, nervous rodents the size of a large rabbit, and the occasional bird. I learned to clean and smoke the meat over the fire pit, hanging thin strips on a rack of green sticks where the heat and smoke could reach them evenly. The smoked meat I stored in sealed bark wraps suspended above the ant line, where it would keep for a week or more in the cool, dry air near the tunnel ceiling. My days developed a rhythm. Wake before dawn, check the drainage trench, inspect the entrance frame for cracks, gather food, improve something, every day improve something. I extended the sleeping platform. I carved shelves into the clay walls for tools and supplies. I built a second, smaller fire pit near the entrance with a stone reflector that directed heat inward without pulling smoke inside. I reinforced the vent shaft with a collar of woven branches packed with clay. Once a week, I walked down to the settlement to trade smoked meat or gathered fruit for salt, cord, or a few matches. They watched me come and go with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Garrett told someone I'd be dead before the wet season. Mrs. Harlan at the mission shook her head when she saw my hands, cracked and calloused, permanently stained with clay. "That boy's playing at something," she told the chaplain. "He'll tire of it." I heard her say it. I didn't respond. Words were just sounds. They couldn't hurt me unless I let them. Then the rain came. Not the soft jungle kind. The kind that arrives like a wall. The kind that doesn't pause between drops. The kind that turns the sky into a solid gray ceiling and makes the earth groan beneath the weight of water it cannot absorb fast enough. It began on a Tuesday in late April. By Wednesday, the river had risen 4 feet. By Thursday, the trails between the settlement and the ridge were ankle-deep in running mud. The canopy, which usually broke the rain into a soft mist, couldn't keep up. Water poured through every gap and ran down every trunk in sheets. I watched from inside the tunnel as the hillside above me absorbed more water than it had in months. Small cracks appeared in the soil above the entrance, hairline fractures that widened slightly each hour. The drainage trench I'd carved was working, but it was designed for normal rain, not this. Water overflowed the stone lining and ran across the top of the tunnel entrance in a thin, steady sheet. I reinforced the entrance frame with 2 additional cross braces and packed fresh clay into every joint. I cleared debris from the drainage trench twice a day. I moved my food stores to the very back of the tunnel, near the limestone wall, and slept with my father's knife in my hand, not because it could help me dig out, but because holding it made me feel less alone. On the 3rd night, the rain intensified. I could hear the difference. The steady drum became a roar. Water wasn't falling anymore. It was being thrown. The wind shifted, driving rain horizontally across the ridge. I felt the temperature drop sharply, the kind of drop that means the storm has pulled cold air down from altitude. My breath became visible inside the tunnel. I pressed my hand against the rear limestone wall. It was colder than I'd ever felt it. The stone conducted the chill straight through from the heart of the hill. I couldn't sleep. I sat on the platform and listened. Around midnight, or what I guessed was midnight, the sound changed. The rain didn't stop, but beneath it I heard something else. A low, grinding noise, deep, not thunder, not water, something structural, something shifting. I'd never heard the earth move before. I got off the platform and crouched near the entrance, pressing my ear to the frame. The wood was vibrating, not shaking, humming. The entire hill was adjusting. Then the slope gave way, not all at once, not a sudden avalanche. It was slower than that, and worse for being slow. A section of the hillside above, and to the left of the tunnel simply released. Tons of waterlogged soil and tangled root mass separated from the stable clay beneath and began to slide downhill. I heard wood snap, trees, or maybe someone's shelter frame. I heard a shout, distant and muffled, cut short by the sound of moving earth. The entrance of the tunnel partially collapsed. Soil poured inward like dark water, filling the first 3 feet of the passage and sealing me from the outside world. Darkness, complete. My fire was buried. My vent shaft was blocked. I could feel the air pressure change immediately, a slight compression against my eardrums. I had the space from roughly where my platform stood to the limestone wall, maybe 8 feet by 6 feet by 5 feet, enough air for hours, not days. If my support frame failed, the rest of the hill would follow. I moved to the back wall and pressed myself against the limestone band, the strongest part of the structure. The curved ceiling above me was holding, but I could hear clay cracking along the left side, small, sharp sounds like knuckles popping. One of the outer braces at the entrance splintered with a sound like a gunshot. I braced myself and waited. The pressure increased. I could feel it in my ears, in my chest, in the way the air seemed to thicken. More clay cracked. A piece of the ceiling near the entrance sagged visibly. I couldn't see it, but I heard the shift and felt a fine rain of particles on my arm. But the arch held. The curved ceiling did what flat surfaces cannot. It distributed the load outward, pressing the weight into the compacted clay walls rather than absorbing it from above. The limestone band at my back was immovable, and the drainage trench, even overwhelmed, had diverted enough water during the previous days to reduce the total saturation of the soil directly above the tunnel. The hillside above me was heavy, but it wasn't as heavy as it could have been. The support wedges I'd driven into, the clay absorbed the lateral shifting force. They bent. Some cracked, but they slowed the movement enough for the earth to find a new angle of rest. The hill settled. The sliding stopped. I sat in perfect darkness, breathing carefully, counting my heartbeats, and waited for morning. When dawn came, I knew it only because the air temperature shifted slightly, a faint warming that told me the sun was touching the hillside somewhere above me. I began to dig. I used my hands and my father's knife. The soil blocking the entrance was wet and heavy, but not compressed. It had poured in, not been packed in. I clawed it backward, handful by handful, piling it against the walls behind me. After what I guessed was 2 hours, I felt air on my fingertips, a thin draft coming through a gap in the debris. I kept digging. By mid-morning, I heard voices, distant at first, then closer. Someone called out, not my name, just a general shout, the kind people make when they're searching. I shouted back. The digging accelerated from both sides. Hands appeared through the soil, adult hands, larger than mine, pulling debris away with an urgency that surprised me. I pushed from within. The gap widened. Light poured in, gray and rain-washed, but blinding after 18 hours of darkness. I crawled out. The hillside was transformed. A wide swath of earth had slid downhill, stripping vegetation and exposing raw clay and stone. 3 surface shelters, built by settlement families who had expanded toward the ridge, were buried under mud and debris. 2 more were damaged beyond repair. Timber, thatch, and personal belongings were scattered across the slope like the aftermath of a river flood on dry land. No one had died. That was the first thing I learned, and the relief of it nearly buckled my knees. But the damage was severe. Weeks of building, gone in a single night. Food stores buried. Tools lost. Families standing in the rain with nothing but what they'd carried when they ran. And the tunnel still stood. Garrett was there. He stared at me as I stepped out of the hillside, covered in clay, blinking against the light. I saw his expression shift, from disbelief to something I couldn't name. Not admiration, exactly. Something quieter. Something that cost him. "The frame held?" he asked. "The arch held," I said. "The frame helped, but it was the shape of the ceiling and the stone behind it." He looked at the exposed slope, at the raw clay and the band of limestone visible now where the landslide had stripped the surface soil away. He looked at the drainage trench, still partially intact, still redirecting water even after the collapse. "You built that trench," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." He nodded slowly. Then he walked away. Mrs. Harlan brought me water and a piece of bread. She didn't say anything about playing at something. She didn't say anything at all. She just handed me the bread and touched my shoulder once, briefly, and left. In the weeks that followed, I rebuilt the entrance stronger than before, but I also did something I hadn't planned. I helped them. 3 families had lost their shelters entirely. They were sleeping under tarps strung between trees, exposed to rain and insects, and the constant threat of another slide. I walked the slope with them and showed them what I'd learned, where the clay was stable, where the limestone ran, where water collected, and where it drained. I showed them the arch principle. I showed them the wedge and clay joint. I showed them the drainage trench design and how a vent shaft could be angled to pull smoke without admitting rain. They listened. Not all of them. Garrett kept his distance, but the others, the ones who had lost everything and had nothing left to protect except their families, they listened the way people listen when survival stops being theoretical. A young woman named Lena, perhaps a year older than me, worked alongside me without being asked. She was the daughter of a river trader who had died of malaria the previous year, and she understood loss the way I did, not as a story, but as a texture in every day. She didn't talk much, but she was precise with her hands and patient with materials. She could tie a lashing faster than I could, and she had an eye for water. She could look at a slope and tell you where the rain would go before it fell. When I designed a new shelter frame using the principles from my tunnel, she studied it quietly for an hour, then pointed at the rear drainage channel. "What if it silts up?" she said. "One season of leaf fall and mud, and you've got a dam instead of a drain." I stared at the design. She was right. I hadn't thought of it. "Secondary channel," I said. "Parallel, 6 inches higher. It only carries water when the first one fails. Or when both fill up at once in a storm like the last one," she said. "Then we make 3. She almost smiled. "Now you're thinking." We built 3 new shelters in 6 weeks. Not tunnels. The others weren't ready to live inside a hill. But hybrid structures. Timber frames with rear walls cut into the stable clay slope. Curved roof lines that distributed load instead of resisting it. Drainage systems above and below. Ventilation shafts that breathed. Each one was slightly different, adapted to the specific contours of the slope where it sat. Lena mapped the water paths. I designed the frames. Together, we tested each joint, each angle, each channel before the families moved in. The first real test came 3 weeks later, when a heavy overnight rain dumped more water on the ridge than any single storm since the landslide. The shelters held. Every one. I stood in the rain that morning and watched the drainage channels do their work. Water flowing cleanly through the stone-lined trenches, diverted away from foundations, running downhill in controlled paths instead of cutting wherever it pleased. The curved roof lines shed water like the back of a river stone. The ventilation shafts breathed dry air into the sleeping chambers. Not a single family woke up wet. They held through the next rain, and the next. By the end of that year, the settlement had shifted. Families that had built on flat, exposed ground began relocating to the slope, using the clay and stone as allies instead of obstacles. My tunnel became a storage depot for the community, cool, dry, and secure. Garrett never apologized. I never expected him to. But one evening, months later, he left a small bundle at the entrance of the tunnel, a good steel chisel and a coil of real rope. No note, nothing spoken. I used that chisel for 30 years. I lived on that ridge for the rest of my life. I married Lena when we were both 20. We raised 4 children in a home I built into the hillside. Not a tunnel anymore, but a true dwelling, with stone-lined rooms that stayed cool in the heat and warm in the cold, with a ventilation system that circulated fresh air through every chamber, with a rainwater collection system that fed a small garden on the terrace above. I taught anyone who wanted to learn. Builders came from other settlements, first from downriver, then from towns I'd never heard of. They arrived skeptical and left quiet, which I learned was the sound of someone rearranging what they thought they knew. A government surveyor visited once in 1941 and spent 3 days studying the drainage designs, taking measurements and making notes in a leather-bound book that smelled of pipe tobacco and old ink. He walked the ridge with me, stopping at each shelter, each drainage channel, each vent shaft. He tapped the curved ceiling of the original tunnel with his knuckles and listened to the sound it made. "Where did you study?" he asked. "Inside a collapsed tunnel," I said. "When I was 16. He laughed. I didn't. I wasn't being clever. I meant it. Everything I knew, I learned by failing first and looking closer second. The jungle taught me, not with kindness, but with consistency. It punished hurry. It rewarded attention. It never cared about my age or my name or what anyone thought of me. It only cared whether I was paying attention. The surveyor wrote something in his book and underlined it twice. Years later, I heard that a passage in a regional engineering report referenced vernacular hillside construction techniques observed in ridge settlements and described arch and drainage principles remarkably similar to mine. No name was attached. That was fine. The knowledge mattered more than the credit. My children grew. 2 stayed on the ridge. My eldest son built homes using the same principles, adapting them as new materials became available, but never abandoning the fundamental logic of working with the slope instead of against it. My younger daughter became a teacher in the lowland town where she taught children to read and write and, on rainy afternoons, told them stories about a boy who lived inside a hill. One traveled north and never came back, though she wrote letters that smelled of different soil, dry soil, mountain soil, soil with no jungle in it at all. I missed her. I missed all of them, even the ones who were still nearby. That's what age does. It teaches you that presence is not the same as closeness, and that love doesn't require proximity to survive. I died on the ridge, in the room I'd built with my own hands, on a night in October when the first rains of the season were just beginning to tap against the stone above me. I was 73. My hands were ruined, swollen, scarred, permanently curved from decades of gripping tools and shaping clay. But they'd built something. Lena sat beside me. She was quieter than she'd been at 17, which is saying something. But her hand on mine was steady, and I could feel the calluses on her palms, matching mine because she'd built alongside me every step. I told her what I'd been thinking, which was the same thing I'd been thinking since I was 16. There's always more to find. She smiled. She knew I wasn't talking about the hill. Outside, the rain began to fall harder. I could hear it running through the drainage channels I'd carved 50 years earlier. Channels that still worked, still carried water away from the foundations, still protected the walls. The tunnel on the ridge still stood. The original arch, the original limestone band, the original curve in the ceiling that had saved my life. All still there, now serving as a root cellar for the community. They said it would cave in. They said I'd freeze or suffocate inside a dirt hole. But the part of the hill they feared was the part that protected me. The thing they dismissed as a buried mistake turned out to be the foundation of everything I built afterward. Every shelter, every drainage system, every arched ceiling, every life that stayed dry when the rains came. And when I close my eyes tonight, I can still feel it. The cold limestone against my back, the darkness pressing in, The hill settling around me like a hand closing gently into a fist, holding me, not burying me, holding me. The rain falls, the arch holds, the stone remembers, and somewhere on that ridge, the tunnel still breathes.